Hey guys, tonight we are going to gently drift back, not to the thunder of cannons or the roar of early biplanes, but to the surprisingly soft flutter of wings against a war-torn sky. Imagine, if you will, a tiny, feathered creature, no bigger than your two hands cupped together, carrying messages that could mean life or death for hundreds, even thousands, of soldiers. We're talking about the unsung, and often rather unassuming, heroes of World War I, the carrier pigeons, some of whom, quite remarkably, earned medals for their bravery. You're probably thinking, pigeons? Aren't those just city birds? And you wouldn't be entirely wrong, but these were a special breed, trained and relied upon in ways that might just astound you. Now, while their service was undeniably heroic, you probably wouldn't enjoy the actual conditions of their lofts near the front lines. Think less luxury avian condo and more drafty wooden box with a distinct aroma of, well, pigeon. It wasn't exactly a five-star resort, even for a bird. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. It really does help the channel find other curious minds like yours. And, as always, I'd love to know where you're listening from and what time it is there. It's always fascinating to see our little community spread across the globe, all settling down for a bit of quiet history. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You find yourself, not in a muddy trench, not yet anyway, but perhaps standing in a sun-drenched courtyard, somewhere in ancient Egypt, maybe around 3000 BC. The air is warm, scented with lotus blossoms and the distant Nile. Look up. See those birds wheeling overhead? Those aren't just any birds. Those are the great-great-great-grandcestors of our World War I heroes. Humanity's partnership with pigeons, or more accurately, rock doves, the wild ancestors of domestic pigeons, is incredibly ancient. It's a relationship that predates written history by a comfortable margin. You see, these birds have an uncanny, almost magical ability, a powerful homing instinct. Take them miles from their home, release them, and with an almost unerring sense of direction, they'll fly back. This wasn't lost on our observant ancestors. The Egyptians were certainly among the first to formally harness this. Imagine a pharaoh needing to send word of a victory, or perhaps a less triumphant message about a delayed shipment of papyrus, across his sprawling kingdom. No email, no telegraph, not even a reliable pony express for quite some time. But he has pigeons. Records show that Egyptian mariners would release pigeons from their ships as they neared port, carrying news of their arrival or important cargo manifests. It was faster than any runner, more reliable than smoke signals on a windy day. These weren't just casual message bearers. This was an established system. Historians still ponder why exactly the pigeon, above other birds with perhaps similar, though less refined, homing capabilities, became the go-to avian messenger. Was it their relative ease of domestication? Their impressive speed and endurance? Or perhaps just a lucky accident of cohabitation that blossomed into a full-blown communication network? Now, fast forward a bit. You're in ancient Greece. The Olympic Games are in full swing. No, not the modern ones with fancy corporate sponsorships, but the original, slightly more rustic affairs. How did news of the victors, the champions of discus or wrestling, travel back to their eager home cities? You guessed it. Pigeons, adorned with a tiny colored ribbon indicating the winner's city-state, would be released from Olympia. Imagine the anticipation in Athens or Sparta, the crowd scanning the skies, waiting for that first flutter of wings bringing news of glory. It was the ancient equivalent of a live sports broadcast, delivered at about 40 to 60 miles per hour, which, for the time, was practically light speed. Pliny the Elder, that wonderfully curious Roman scholar, wrote extensively about the use of pigeons, noting how they were used to send messages during sieges, even suggesting that Brutus used them to communicate with his allies. He even mentioned pigeon fanciers paying exorbitant prices for birds with good pedigrees, a tradition that, funnily enough, continues to this day in the world of pigeon racing. Some things never change, even if the messages now are less about besieged Roman legions and more about who won the local club race. One rather quirky tidbit from this era involves the Roman military. They apparently developed mobile pigeon lofts, essentially pigeon coops on carts that could accompany legions on the march. This meant they always had a reliable, if somewhat coup-prone, communication system, even deep in newly conquered, and likely rather uncooperative, territory. You can almost picture a grumpy centurion, covered in Gallic mud, meticulously attaching a tiny scroll to a pigeon's leg, muttering about how much easier things would be if the locals just learned Latin properly. The use wasn't confined to Europe or the Mediterranean. In Persia, and later across the Islamic world, extensive pigeon post systems, known as barid, were highly developed. Caliphs maintained elaborate networks of pigeon towers, ensuring swift communication across vast empires. Genghis Khan, that master of far-flung conquest, is said to have used pigeons to link the various parts of his enormous empire, stretching from Asia to Europe. When you're managing that much real estate, you need a messaging system that's faster than a horse, especially if the horse has to cross the Gobi Desert. So, as you can see, by the time we even start approaching the 19th and early 20th centuries, the idea of using pigeons to carry messages wasn't just some quaint, forgotten practice. It was a tried, tested, and surprisingly sophisticated method of communication with a pedigree stretching back millennia. These birds weren't just pets. They were vital infrastructure, the unsung heroes of countless historical moments, long before they were called upon to face the unprecedented challenges of the Great War. They were, in essence, the original airmail service, operating with a biological GPS that scientists today are still trying to fully understand. And it's this deep, ingrained history, this long reliance on their incredible navigational skills, that set the stage for their crucial, and often perilous, role in the conflict that was to come. Now let's gently glide forward in time, past the age of empires relying solely on feathered wings, and into the early 20th century. You find yourself amidst a world rapidly modernizing, a world crackling with new technologies. The telegraph, that marvel of Victorian innovation, is well established, its wires humming with Morse code messages across continents and under oceans. The telephone, though still a bit clunky and expensive, is connecting cities and businesses with increasing speed. And on the horizon, wireless telegraphy radio is just beginning to hint at its revolutionary potential. It seemed for a moment that the humble pigeon, that faithful messenger of antiquity, might finally be heading for a well-deserved retirement, perhaps to a quiet dovecot in the countryside, far from the urgent demands of human communication. But then came August 1914. The world plunged into the Great War, a conflict unlike any seen before. It was a war that combined old tactics with terrifying new industrial-scale weaponry. And with this new kind of warfare came an unprecedented crisis in communications. You might imagine that with telegraphs and telephones, commanders would have a clear, instantaneous picture of the battlefield. But the reality, as you'll soon see, was quite different. The early days of World War I were a brutal lesson in how quickly modern technology could be overwhelmed, or outright destroyed, by modern warfare. Picture the scene. You're in a forward observation post, perhaps a hastily dug trench or a camouflaged shell hole, just a few hundred yards from the enemy. Artillery shells are screaming overhead, a relentless, deafening barrage. The ground shudders with each impact. Your field telephone line, painstakingly laid by a signalsman under the cover of darkness, has just gone dead. A well-aimed shell, or perhaps just the constant churning of the earth, has severed the connection. The wire is cut. Your radio, if you're lucky enough to have one of the early, bulky, and temperamental sets, is likely struggling with interference, or its antenna has been shot to pieces. Runners, those brave men tasked with physically carrying messages, face a terrifying gauntlet of machine gun fire, snipers, and shrapnel. Their casualty rates were appallingly high. Suddenly, all that modern technology feels very fragile, very fallible. This is where our feathered friend, the carrier pigeon, makes its rather unexpected, yet utterly vital, comeback. In the chaos and destruction of the Western Front, where trench lines became static and communication was a life-or-death struggle, the pigeon offered a unique advantage. It was wireless, it was relatively small and fast, and it didn't rely on vulnerable ground infrastructure. It could, quite literally, fly over the problems that plagued other communication methods. Historians still ponder why exactly the military planners of the early 20th century, despite the advent of newer technologies, still maintained and even expanded their pigeon services. Perhaps it was a deep-seated understanding of the unreliability of new tech under extreme duress, or maybe just a belt and suspenders approach to something as critical as battlefield communication. Whatever the reason, it proved to be an incredibly prescient decision. The British Army, for example, entered the war with a relatively modest pigeon service, but quickly realized its immense value. By the end of the war, they would employ around 22,000 pigeons and 150 pigeoneers, or loft men. The French had an even more extensive system, having used pigeons effectively in the Franco-Prussian War of 1870–71, particularly during the Siege of Paris, where pigeons were the only means of getting messages out of the surrounded city. They even experimented with microphotography, shrinking documents down to tiny film strips that a single pigeon could carry, a precursor to the microfilm of later espionage. The Germans, too, had a highly developed pigeon service, with mobile lofts that could be moved close to the front lines, a tactic reminiscent of those ancient Roman pigeon carts, now adapted for industrial warfare. Even the Americans, latecomers to the war, quickly established their own U.S. Army Signal Corps pigeon service. One quirky tidbit from this period is the sheer variety of ways armies tried to protect their pigeon lofts from enemy attack. Some were camouflaged with branches and netting, others were dug into the sides of hills, and some mobile lofts were even armored, though one imagines that too much armor would make the loft rather difficult to mobilize. There were also concerted efforts to counter the enemy's pigeon use. Snipers were sometimes tasked with shooting down enemy pigeons, and hawks were even trained by some sides to intercept them, a sort of avian dogfight, high above the trenches. The success rate of these pigeon hawks, however, is a matter of some debate among military ornithologists, if such a specialization truly exists. It sounds a bit like something out of a fantastical novel, but it was a genuine, if somewhat niche, aspect of World War I aerial warfare. So, you can see the picture for me. The battlefield is a maelstrom of mud, wire, and explosions. Traditional communication lines are severed as quickly as they're laid. Radio is in its infancy, often unreliable and easily jammed or pinpointed by the enemy. Runners are brave but incredibly vulnerable. In this desperate environment, the sight of a friendly pigeon, circling once before heading purposefully towards home with its vital message, must have been an incredible relief, a small winged symbol of hope amidst the technological and human carnage. They weren't just a backup plan. In many situations, they were the only plan. Their ability to navigate through smoke, over shell-pocked landscapes, and often through enemy fire, made them an indispensable asset, a living, breathing communication line that couldn't easily be cut by shrapnel or silenced by a sniper's bullet aimed at a human target. The stage was set for these ordinary birds to perform extraordinary feats. Alright, so we've established the critical need for these feathered messengers in the cauldron of World War I. But where did these pigeons actually come from? You couldn't just wander into Trafalgar Square, net a few dozen of the local residents, and expect them to reliably deliver dispatches from the Somme. No, recruiting and selecting a war pigeon was a much more considered affair, a process that blended age-old pigeon fancying knowledge with the urgent demands of modern warfare. You find yourself now, perhaps, in a quiet corner of rural England, or maybe a pre-war Belgian village renowned for its pigeon racing traditions. Here, the air isn't thick with cordite, but with the gentle cooing and rustling of wings from countless dovecots. For centuries, pigeon racing had been a popular sport, a serious hobby for many, and it was from these dedicated civilian breeders and racers that the military primarily sourced its avian recruits. These weren't your average, slightly scruffy city pigeons content with discarded sandwich crusts. These were the thoroughbreds of the pigeon world, birds with proven pedigrees, strong flight muscles, excellent homing instincts, and a certain indefinable quality of intelligence and determination. The British War Office, for instance, put out calls for pigeon donations from civilian fanciers. Imagine the scene: a local squire or a working-class miner, both passionate about their birds, carefully selecting their best racers, their prize winners, and handing them over to a stern-faced army captain. It must have been a poignant moment for many, giving up birds they'd raised and trained, knowing they were heading into harm's way. There was a patriotic duty involved, certainly, but also a quiet pride that their feathered champions could serve their country. The slogan, "A bird in the air is worth 1,000 men on the ground," became a popular, if slightly hyperbolic, saying, emphasizing their value. What specific qualities were they looking for in these potential war heroes? Firstly, and most obviously, was an impeccable homing ability. The pigeon needed to be able to return to its specific mobile loft, often relocated near the ever-shifting front lines, from distances of many miles, sometimes over unfamiliar and dangerous territory. Speed was also crucial. A message arriving hours, or even minutes, earlier could make a significant difference. Endurance was another key factor. These birds might have to fly for extended periods, battling strong winds, rain, or the disorienting effects of smoke and gas. Historians still ponder why exactly some bloodlines of pigeons excelled so consistently in these demanding conditions. Was it purely genetics, or did the specific training regimens of certain breeders play a more significant role? The physical characteristics were also important. A good war pigeon was typically medium-sized, well-muscled but not too heavy, with strong wings and good feather quality. Their eyesight was paramount, not just for navigation but also for spotting and evading predators, both natural and human. Interestingly, the color of the pigeon sometimes played a role. Darker, blue-gray birds, known as blue bars or blue checkers, were often preferred as they were thought to be less conspicuous against the sky than lighter-colored or white birds, making them harder targets for enemy marksmen. However, some pigeonniers swore by their pied Baedekind partially colored, or grizzles, arguing that a good bird was a good bird, regardless of its plumage. It was one of those perennial debates you find in any specialized field, like arguments over the best type of rifle or the most effective trenching tool. One quirky tidbit related to recruitment involved the Belgians. Belgium was, and still is, a hotbed of pigeon racing. When Germany invaded Belgium in 1914, they knew the strategic value of pigeons. One of their early actions was to try and confiscate all Belgian racing pigeons to prevent them from being used by the Allies or for espionage. Many Belgian fanciers went to extraordinary lengths to hide their best birds, sometimes smuggling them out of the country or keeping them in secret lofts. It was a small act of resistance, protecting their feathered assets from the occupying forces. There are even stories of birds being smuggled across borders in bicycle baskets or hidden under floorboards. The American Expeditionary Forces, when they joined the war, had to build their pigeon service almost from scratch. They imported birds from Britain and France and also relied on donations from American pigeon fanciers. They established training centers and mobile lofts, quickly getting up to speed. The U.S. Army Signal Corps even published detailed manuals on pigeon care and training, emphasizing the importance of kindness and consistent handling. These weren't just dumb animals to be exploited. They were seen as valuable assets requiring skilled management. The process wasn't always smooth. Sometimes, donated birds weren't up to snuff, or they struggled to adapt to the harsh conditions of military life. There was also the constant need to replace losses, as the casualty rate among pigeons, as we'll see, could be very high. Breeding programs were established near the front to try and maintain a steady supply of trained birds. It was a continuous cycle of recruitment, training, deployment, and, all too often, replacement. So, you have these carefully selected birds, these avian athletes, plucked from their peaceful civilian lives and thrust into the grim reality of war. They weren't volunteers in the human sense, of course, but their innate abilities made them uniquely suited for the tasks ahead. Their journey from the quiet lofts of fanciers to the noisy, dangerous skies over the Western Front was just beginning. Next, they would have to endure a rigorous boot camp, designed to hone their skills and prepare them for the life-saving missions they were destined to undertake. The transformation from prize racer to war hero was about to commence. All right. Our carefully selected avian recruits have arrived, perhaps a little ruffled from their journey, at a military pigeon station. This isn't a place of parade ground drills or rifle practice, but it's a boot camp, nonetheless, a specialized training ground designed to transform these feathered athletes into reliable, life-saving messengers. You can almost smell the distinct aroma of pigeon feed, hear the constant soft cooing, and see the pigeoneers, the loft men, moving with quiet efficiency among their charges. The training process for a World War I carrier pigeon was surprisingly meticulous and built upon centuries of pigeon fancying wisdom, now adapted for the grim realities of the front line. The core principle, of course, relied on the pigeon's natural homing instinct. But this instinct needed to be carefully conditioned and directed. You couldn't just toss a bird into the air and hope it knew where the divisional headquarters had moved to that morning. The process usually began when the pigeons were still young, often as squeakers. That's the rather charming term for young pigeons, just a few weeks old. The first step was to get them accustomed to their home loft. This would be their safe place, their destination, the place they would always strive to return to. For pigeons serving in mobile lofts, this was particularly crucial. These lofts, sometimes horse-drawn wagons or even converted London buses, would frequently move as the front lines shifted. So, the birds had to learn to recognize their specific mobile home, even if its surroundings changed dramatically. Imagine the confusion for a bird if its home was in a peaceful French orchard one day and amidst a landscape of shell craters the next. Historians still ponder why exactly pigeons are able to reorient to a mobile loft so effectively, though it's believed to involve a combination of visual cues around the loft itself and an innate ability to map new locations relative to their established home base memory. Training flights would start short. A young bird might be taken just a few hundred yards from the loft and released. If it returned successfully, and they almost always did, it would be rewarded, perhaps with its favorite seed mix. Gradually, the distances would be increased, a mile, then 5 miles, then 10, then 20, and so on. These training flights were known as tosses. The pigeoneers kept detailed records of each bird's performance, its speed, its reliability, how well it coped with different weather conditions. It was all very scientific, in its own early 20th century way. A key aspect of training was teaching the birds to enter the loft quickly upon their return. In a war situation, every second counted. A pigeon circling leisurely overhead before deciding to pop in for a snack wasn't ideal if it was carrying urgent news of an impending attack. So, lofts were designed with special one-way entrances, often a series of bobbing wires called a trap, which allowed birds to enter easily but prevented them from getting out again until the pigeoneer collected them. The birds were trained to head straight for this trap. Sometimes, a pigeoneer would use a specific call or whistle as the birds approached, signaling that it was safe to land and that food awaited. One quirky tidbit from pigeon training involved getting them used to the sounds of battle. Some training lofts were deliberately situated near artillery ranges or areas where rifle practice took place. The idea was to desensitize the birds to loud noises, so they wouldn't panic and fly off course when faced with the roar of guns on the actual battlefield. You can imagine a grizzled old pigeoneer, calmly tending his birds while shells whizzed overhead, muttering, "Don't mind that, lads, just a bit of target practice." It sounds a bit mad, but it was all part of preparing them for the sensory overload of the front. Another specialized form of training was for two-way pigeons. Most pigeons are trained to home to one loft, but some exceptionally intelligent birds were trained to fly between two different lofts. This was incredibly useful for maintaining communication between, say, a forward trench and a battalion headquarters. This required even more painstaking training, teaching the bird that both locations were home, and that it would be fed and cared for at either end. These birds were highly prized, the special forces of the pigeon world. The pigeoneers themselves were a crucial part of this process. They were often men who had been civilian pigeon fanciers before the war, bringing their deep knowledge and passion for the birds with them. They understood pigeon behavior, could spot signs of illness or fatigue, and knew how to motivate their charges. There was often a real bond between a pigeoneer and his birds. These weren't just tools of war. They were living creatures under their care. They knew each bird by name or number, its quirks, its strengths, and its weaknesses. This human element was vital to the success of the pigeon service. The final stage of boot camp involved acclimatizing the birds to being carried in the small wicker baskets or cloth bags that soldiers would use to transport them to the point of release. They also had to get used to having the tiny message capsules, usually made of aluminum, attached to their legs. This had to be done carefully, ensuring the capsule was secure but didn't impede the bird's flight or chafe its leg. By the end of their training, these pigeons were more than just homing birds. They were disciplined, reliable messengers, ready to face the dangers of the front. They had learned to navigate, to endure, and to return, no matter what. Their graduation wasn't marked with a parade, but with their first operational flight, carrying a real message, perhaps from a damp trench or a forward observation post, back to their waiting loft. A tiny speck of life against a vast, war-torn sky. The real test was about to begin. Having graduated from their rather unique form of boot camp, our feathered soldiers are now ready for active service. But what was daily life like for these pigeons, and for the pigeoneers who cared for them, often just a stone's throw from the front lines? You're now peering into one of these lofts, perhaps a sturdy wooden structure, camouflaged with netting and earth, or maybe one of those converted London omnibuses, painted a drab olive green, its former advertisements for Bovril or Pear's soap long gone. Inside, it's a world of soft cooing, the rustle of wings, and the faint, earthy scent of pigeon feed and, well, pigeon droppings. It's surprisingly orderly. The loft is divided into individual nesting boxes, each a small, private compartment for a pair of birds or a resting single. Here, the pigeons would rest, preen their feathers, and await their next mission. The pigeoneers, often men with a deep, almost paternal affection for their charges, move with a practiced calm. Their day would start early, long before the dawn chorus of artillery usually began. First light would mean a thorough check of all the birds. Are they healthy? Any signs of injury from a previous flight? Any listlessness that might indicate illness? Pigeons, like any livestock, were susceptible to diseases, and in the cramped, often damp conditions near the front, an outbreak could be disastrous for a loft. Hygiene was paramount, though battlefield hygiene is perhaps a relative term. Lofts were cleaned as regularly as possible, fresh water was provided, and the feed, typically a mix of grains like corn, peas, and wheat, was carefully rationed. A well-fed pigeon was a strong flyer, but an overfed one might be a bit sluggish, not ideal when speed was of the essence. The pigeoneers were responsible for more than just feeding and cleaning. They were the record keepers, meticulously logging every bird, its service record, its flights, the messages it carried, and its return times. Each bird often had a leg band with a unique serial number, like a tiny dog tag. This information was vital for assessing the reliability of different birds and routes. Historians still ponder why exactly certain pigeons developed almost legendary reputations for reliability, while others, despite identical care and training, were merely adequate. Was it an unquantifiable grit, or just subtle variations in navigational acumen? A significant part of the pigeoneer's day involved managing the commute of the pigeons. Birds destined for use by forward units would be carefully placed in small, portable wicker baskets or specially designed cloth vests worn by soldiers. These baskets needed to be light enough for a soldier to carry, often through treacherous trench systems, yet sturdy enough to protect the bird. Imagine a soldier, already laden with his rifle, ammunition, and rations, also carrying a basket of cooing pigeons up to the front line. It adds a rather surreal, almost gentle, image to the usual grim depictions of trench life. Once the pigeons reached their forward deployment point, perhaps a company headquarters in a ruined farmhouse, or an artillery battery hidden in a copse of trees, they would be kept ready for use. When a message needed to be sent, it would be written on a small piece of flimsy paper, often cigarette paper or special lightweight message forms. Brevity was key. The message would then be rolled tightly and inserted into that tiny aluminum capsule we mentioned earlier, which was then carefully attached to the pigeon's leg. One quirky tidbit: some capsules were color-coded, perhaps red for urgent messages or a different color to indicate the originating unit, allowing for quick sorting back at the receiving loft. It was a simple but effective system for prioritizing incoming intelligence. The release itself was a moment of quiet tension. The soldier would hold the bird gently, point it roughly in the direction of its home loft, though the pigeon generally knew better, and then toss it into the air. There would be that anxious moment as the bird circled once or twice, orienting itself amidst the smoke and noise, before striking out on its determined flight path. For the soldiers watching it go, that small, rapidly diminishing speck in the sky carried their hopes, their reports, perhaps their very survival. Back at the home loft, the pigeoneers would be on alert. They knew which birds were out and roughly when to expect them back, though roughly was the operative word, given the hazards. The sound of a returning bird, the flutter of wings at the trap, would galvanize them into action. The bird would be gently retrieved, the message capsule removed, and the message itself rushed to the intelligence officers or commanders awaiting it. The pigeon, its duty done, would be rewarded with food and water and allowed to rest. For the bird, it was just another flight home. For the army, it could be the piece of information that saved a battalion or pinpointed a crucial enemy position. Life in the loft wasn't all missions and danger, though. There was a rhythm to it, a routine. Pigeons would mate and raise young, even in these frontline lofts, ensuring a new generation of messengers. The pigeoneers would talk to their birds, a lone murmur of encouragement and affection. In a world of constant stress and brutality, these lofts were small oases of a different kind of life, a reminder of something beyond the mud and the wire. The bond between man and bird, forged in the crucible of war, was a quiet testament to the unexpected connections that can arise in the most trying of circumstances. So, our brave pigeon is airborne, launched from a muddy trench or a camouflaged observation post. Attached to its leg is a tiny aluminum cylinder, no bigger than a thimble, yet potentially holding information that could shift the course of a local engagement, save a stranded unit, or provide crucial intelligence for a coming offensive. Let's take a closer look at these miniature scrolls and the ingenious methods used to ensure their precious cargo reached its destination. You're now in that cramped forward position, the message just dictated by a harried officer, his face smudged with dirt and fatigue. The pigeoneer, or perhaps a designated signalsman, carefully takes the slip of paper. These weren't lengthy epistles. Space was at an absolute premium. Messages had to be concise, almost like an early form of military telegram or, dare I say, a battlefield tweet. Every word counted. Standardized abbreviations and codes were often used to cram as much information as possible onto the tiny form. Artillery barrage needed grid square X, enemy machine gun nest at Y, advancing, need reinforcements C. Clear, to the point, and utterly vital. The paper itself was specially chosen. It had to be lightweight to minimize the burden on the bird, yet durable enough to withstand being tightly rolled and handled, sometimes in damp or muddy conditions. Rice paper or very thin, flimsy paper, similar to that used for rolling cigarettes, was common. Some units had pre-printed forms, with spaces for coordinates, times, and unit designators, further streamlining the process. Writing would be done with a pencil or indelible ink, something that wouldn't smudge or run if it got a bit damp, a frequent occurrence in the trenches. Once the message was written, it was carefully rolled or folded into a tight cylinder. Then came the crucial step of inserting it into the capsule. These capsules, as we've mentioned, were typically made of aluminum because it was light and strong. They were marvels of miniature engineering, designed to be waterproof and to protect the message from the elements and the rigors of flight. Most had a small screw-on cap or a hinge lid that snapped shut securely. You can imagine the fumbling fingers, perhaps numb with cold or trembling with adrenaline, trying to manipulate these tiny components in the dim light of a dugout. Historians still ponder why exactly the leg was chosen as the primary attachment point, rather than, say, a small harness. It likely came down to a balance of security, minimal aerodynamic drag, and the bird's comfort. Attaching the capsule to the pigeon's leg was an art in itself. It couldn't be too tight, or it would restrict circulation or chafe the bird. Too loose, and it might slip off during the flight. Most capsules had a small flange or loop through which a soft leather strap or a purpose-made metal leg band could be threaded. The pigeoneer would gently hold the bird, extend its leg, and secure the capsule, ensuring it was snug but not constricting. The bird, accustomed to this procedure from its training, would usually remain quite calm. It knew what was coming next: the flight home. One quirky tidbit concerns the development of pigeon cameras. While not widely used for standard messaging due to the weight and complexity, both the Germans and, later, the Allies experimented with tiny, lightweight automatic cameras that could be strapped to a pigeon's breast. The camera would be set to take pictures at timed intervals as the pigeon flew over enemy lines, providing a literal bird's-eye view of trenches, fortifications, and troop movements. The quality of these early aerial reconnaissance photos was often variable, and the pigeon didn't always fly in the most strategically useful direction, but it was an ingenious, if somewhat unreliable, innovation. Imagine trying to brief a pigeon on its designated photo reconnaissance flight path. Alright, Squawks, we need good coverage of the Hun trenches at grid 42B, then a pass over that suspicious-looking wood. And try to keep it steady, there's a good chap. Once the message was secured, and the bird released, the fate of that tiny capsule and its vital news rested entirely on the pigeon's ability to navigate home. Back at the receiving loft, the arrival of a bird would trigger a well-rehearsed procedure. The pigeoneer on duty would quickly and gently retrieve the bird from the trap, offer it a reassuring coo, and then carefully detach the capsule. The capsule would be unscrewed, the tiny scroll extracted, and then smoothed out. Sometimes, if the message was particularly urgent or complex, it would be handed straight to a waiting runner or motorcyclist to be sped to the relevant command post. The efficiency of this system was remarkable. In good conditions, a pigeon could cover distances of 20 to 30 miles in under an hour. For a unit cut off by shellfire, that hour could be the difference between annihilation and relief. The messages themselves, now preserved in archives, offer a poignant glimpse into the realities of the front line: desperate pleas for ammunition, cool-headed reports of enemy movements, and occasionally, even messages of defiance or survival from surrounded units. Each tiny scroll represents a moment of intense human drama, entrusted to the wings of a bird. The system wasn't foolproof, of course. Pigeons could get lost, be shot down, or fall prey to hawks. But the sheer volume of messages successfully delivered testifies to the courage of these birds and the dedication of the men who trained and cared for them. That tiny capsule, glinting on a pigeon's leg, was a lifeline. Our pigeon is aloft, the crucial message secured to its leg. The familiar comfort of the home loft is its destination, but the journey there is anything but a simple commute. The skies over World War I battlefields were a dangerous place, even for a small, swift bird. You're flying alongside our feathered hero now, feeling the wind beneath your wings, the rhythmic beat of your own flight, but also sensing the myriad perils that lie between you and safety. The most obvious danger came from human adversaries. Soldiers on both sides were well aware of the enemy's use of pigeons. A lone pigeon, flying with purpose, was a clear indication that a message was being sent. As such, they often became targets. Enemy snipers, with their keen eyes and accurate rifles, would sometimes take aim at these avian messengers. It sounds almost cruel, shooting at a bird, but in the context of total war, anything that carried enemy intelligence was a legitimate target. Imagine the skill required to hit a small, fast-moving bird at a distance with the standard infantry rifle. It wasn't easy, but it happened. Some units even had designated pigeon shooters, men known for their marksmanship, tasked specifically with trying to bring down enemy birds. Then there was the artillery. While a pigeon was unlikely to be hit directly by a shell unless it was exceptionally unlucky, the sheer volume of shrapnel and debris thrown into the air by constant bombardments posed a significant threat. A bird could be struck by a flying piece of metal, its wings shattered, its flight ended abruptly. The concussive force of nearby explosions could also disorient a bird, throwing it off course or even stunning it mid-air. Historians still ponder why exactly pigeons, with their delicate physiology, were able to navigate and survive such an intensely hostile soundscape, though their ability to fly above much of the ground-level chaos was a distinct advantage. Gas attacks, one of the most horrific innovations of World War I, also posed a threat to pigeons. While the birds often flew above the densest clouds of chlorine or mustard gas that clung to the ground, drifting plumes could still affect them. Their respiratory systems were vulnerable, just like humans. There are accounts of pigeons returning to their lofts showing signs of gas poisoning, their eyes irritated, their breathing labored. Pigeoneers did their best to protect their lofts if a gas attack was imminent, often by covering openings with damp blankets, but a bird caught in flight had little defense. One rather quirky and sad tidbit is that canaries were famously used in trenches to detect gas, but pigeons, being out in the open and flying through it, sometimes served as unwilling, and often fatal, indicators of its presence further afield. Beyond the human-made dangers, there were also natural predators. Hawks and falcons, the natural enemies of pigeons, patrolled the skies. For a lone pigeon, already stressed and perhaps flying over unfamiliar territory, an attack from a swift peregrine falcon could be deadly. Some military units even experimented with training their own hawks to intercept enemy pigeons, as we touched upon earlier. It was a grim form of biological warfare, feathered hunter versus feathered messenger. The success of these hawk patrols is debated, but they certainly added another layer of peril to a pigeon's journey. Weather conditions also played a significant role. Strong headwinds could exhaust a bird, dramatically slowing its progress. Heavy rain could soak its feathers, making flight difficult and chilling the bird. Fog or low cloud could obscure landmarks, making navigation a challenge even for the most experienced homing pigeon. Pigeoneers would anxiously watch the weather, knowing that a difficult flight could mean a delayed or a lost message. There was little they could do but wait, and hope their birds had the strength and skill to make it through. Despite all these dangers, the bullets, the shrapnel, the gas, the hawks, the storms, the remarkable thing is how many pigeons did get through. Their innate drive to return to their home loft was incredibly powerful. They would fly through smoke-filled skies, over battle-scarred landscapes, often taking circuitous routes to avoid the worst of the shelling or known enemy positions. Their small size and speed made them difficult targets, and their natural camouflage helped them blend in against the often gray, overcast skies of northern Europe. The casualty rates for pigeons could be high, sometimes as much as 10% on particularly dangerous missions or in heavily contested sectors. But that still meant that 90% were succeeding, a testament to their resilience and the effectiveness of the system. Each bird that returned, especially one showing signs of a difficult flight, perhaps with a ruffled feather, a slight limp, or just an air of exhaustion, was greeted with relief and admiration by the pigeoneers. These weren't just cogs in a machine. They were individuals, each with its own story of survival against the odds. Their courage, though instinctive rather than intellectual, was undeniable. They faced the dangers of the modern battlefield with nothing but their wings and their incredible homing instinct, silent heroes in a very noisy war. Amidst the countless tales of bravery and endurance displayed by these feathered messengers, some individual pigeons achieved legendary status, their names whispered with a mixture of awe and affection by the soldiers whose lives they often impacted. Perhaps the most famous of these avian heroes, a name that still resonates in the annals of military history, is Cher Ami, French for "Dear Friend." You're about to meet this remarkable bird, not as a legend, but as a small, determined creature embarking on her service. Cher Ami was a blue checker cock pigeon, though often referred to with feminine pronouns due to her name, donated by pigeon fanciers in Britain to the U.S. Army Signal Corps. She was one of around 600 birds gifted by Britain to the American forces to help them establish their own pigeon service when they entered the war in 1917. You can imagine her, a young but promising bird, crated and shipped across the Atlantic, eventually finding herself in a U.S. Army loft in France, under the care of dedicated American pigeoneers. Her early service, before her most famous flight, was already distinguished. Like all reliable war pigeons, Cher Ami would have undertaken numerous successful missions, carrying messages from various American units back to their headquarters. Each flight was a small victory, a successful delivery of information through the hazardous skies. She would have learned the routes, become familiar with the landscape of northeastern France, its shattered villages, its shell-pocked fields, its winding trench systems. She would have experienced the routine dangers, the crack of rifles, the distant crump of artillery, the occasional menacing shadow of a hawk. Pigeoneers would have noted her consistency, her speed, her unerring ability to return to her mobile loft, even when it had been relocated. These qualities would have marked her out as one of their best birds, a reliable asset in a system where reliability was paramount. Historians still ponder why exactly some individual pigeons, like Cher Ami, displayed such exceptional navigational skills and resilience. Was it superior genetics, a particularly strong bond with her home loft and handlers, or simply an unquantifiable element of what we might call courage in an animal? You can picture her in the loft, a relatively small bird, perhaps preening her blue-gray feathers, or taking a drink of water, seemingly indistinguishable from the dozens of other pigeons around her. Yet there was something special about Cher Ami, something that would soon be tested in the crucible of one of the war's most desperate situations. Her handlers would have known her number, perhaps even had a nickname for her beyond her official designation. They would have cared for her, ensuring she was well-fed and healthy, unknowingly preparing her for the flight that would etch her name into history. One quirky tidbit about the U.S. Pigeon Service is that they took the welfare of their birds very seriously. Manuals issued to pigeoneers emphasize gentle handling and the importance of keeping the lofts clean and comfortable. They recognized that a happy, healthy pigeon was a more effective messenger. There were even instructions on how to perform minor first aid on injured birds. This wasn't just about sentimentality. It was a practical approach to maintaining a vital communication asset. Cher Ami would have benefited from this dedicated care. Her beat, so to speak, was the Meuse-Argonne sector, a scene of intense fighting in the latter part of 1918 as the Allies pushed to break the German lines. This was a particularly challenging environment for pigeons. The terrain was difficult, a dense forest broken by ravines and hills, and the fighting was fierce, with artillery bombardments a constant feature. Flying over the Argonne forest, with its tall trees and limited visibility, required exceptional navigational skills. Before her most famous mission, Cher Ami had already completed several important flights in this sector. Each time she returned, often through heavy fire, she brought back information that helped commanders understand the unfolding battle, direct artillery, or send support to units in need. She was, in essence, building up a track record of reliability and courage, though, of course, a pigeon doesn't think in terms of courage. It thinks in terms of home, of the drive to return to its loft. But the outcome, from a human perspective, was undeniably brave. The stage was slowly being set for her most critical test. The American forces were engaged in a major offensive, and communication breakdowns were frequent and dangerous. Units could easily become isolated, their positions unknown, their fate hanging in the balance. It was in this chaotic and perilous environment that Cher Ami would be called upon to undertake a flight that would not only save lives but also cement her place as one of the greatest animal heroes of World War I. Her previous missions were the prelude, the training ground for the extraordinary feat of endurance and determination that was to come. The dear friend was about to live up to her name in the most dramatic way imaginable. The date is October 3, 1918. You find yourself in a grim, isolated pocket of the Argonne forest. This is the predicament of Major Charles Whittlesey and his mixed battalion of American soldiers, soon to be grimly nicknamed the Lost Battalion. They had advanced deep into enemy territory as part of the Meuse-Argonne offensive, but supporting units on their flanks had failed to keep pace or had been pushed back. Now nearly 600 men found themselves surrounded by German forces, cut off from supplies, reinforcements, and crucially, communication. Their situation was desperate. They were low on ammunition, food, and water. Casualties were mounting, not just from German attacks but also, tragically, from friendly artillery fire that was falling short, unaware of the battalion's precise, advanced position. They were trapped in a small ravine, under constant sniper fire and machine gun barrages. Major Whittlesey knew that without getting a message out, his command was doomed. Their only hope lay in the wicker basket of carrier pigeons they had brought with them. One by one, they released their birds. The first carried a message. "Many wounded. We cannot evacuate." It was shot down almost immediately by German riflemen who knew the Americans would be trying to use pigeons. A second bird was released with a similar plea. It too met a hail of bullets. The Germans were clearly determined that no message would get through. The hopes of the surrounded men dwindled with each failed attempt. Historians still ponder why exactly the initial pigeon releases were so observable by the enemy. Perhaps the terrain offered limited cover for the launch, or the Germans had simply anticipated this exact tactic. The men of the lost battalion were watching their last chances flutter away. Their radio was useless, damaged beyond repair. Runners had been sent out, but none had made it through the tight German cordon. Now, with only one pigeon left, the pressure was immense. That last bird was Cher Ami. You can imagine the scene, the grimy, exhausted soldiers, their faces etched with fear and a grim determination, watching as Major Whittlesey himself, or one of his officers, carefully wrote the final, desperate message. It read, "We are along the road parallel 276.4. Our artillery is dropping a barrage directly on US. For heaven's sake, stop it." The urgency, the sheer life-or-death nature of this plea, is palpable even now, reading those words a century later. The tiny scroll was carefully inserted into the capsule on Cher Ami's leg. This was it. Their last feathered lifeline. A soldier, perhaps with a silent prayer, gently tossed Cher Ami into the air. She rose above the trees, a small, dark silhouette against the gray, indifferent sky. And immediately, the German machine guns opened up. It must have been a terrifying sight for the men below. Their last hope, their dear friend, was flying directly into a storm of bullets. For a moment, it seemed she too would fall. She was hit. The soldiers saw her falter, saw her tumble in the air as if mortally wounded. A cry of despair might have gone up from the beleaguered men. It looked as though their last chance was gone. But then, miraculously, Cher Ami righted herself. Despite her injuries, despite the bullets whizzing past her, she began to climb again. She had been hit in the breast, blinded in one eye, and one of her legs was shattered, hanging by a single tendon, the vital message capsule still attached. Yet, fueled by that incredible, indomitable homing instinct, and perhaps a degree of shock-induced adrenaline, she flew on. She covered the 25 miles back to her loft at Rampont in just 65 minutes, a remarkable speed even for a healthy bird, let alone one so grievously wounded. She flew through a hail of lead, over enemy lines, driven by an instinct more powerful than fear, more resilient than pain. When she arrived at her loft, she didn't land gracefully. She virtually collapsed onto the landing board, a bloody, broken little hero. The pigeoneers on duty rushed to her. They saw her terrible injuries, the blood matting her feathers, the mangled leg. But they also saw the capsule. They carefully detached it and raced the message to headquarters. The effect was immediate. The friendly artillery barrage that had been decimating the lost battalion was lifted. Relief efforts were redirected. Because of Cher Ami's incredible flight, the surviving 194 men of the lost battalion were eventually rescued 2 days later. Sher Ami's flight was more than just a successful mission. It was an act of almost unbelievable endurance and determination. She had flown through a curtain of enemy fire, grievously wounded, to deliver a message that directly saved the lives of nearly 200 men. It's a story that, even with the passage of time, retains its power to astonish and inspire. This small bird, facing the full fury of industrial warfare, had shown a resilience that was nothing short of heroic. Sher Ami's incredible flight to save the lost battalion is perhaps the most famous, but it's by no means the only story of pigeons continuing their missions despite horrific injuries. The annals of the various Allied pigeon services are filled with accounts of birds demonstrating an almost unbelievable tenacity, driven by that powerful homing instinct to deliver their messages, no matter the cost to themselves. You're now witnessing some of these astonishing displays of avian fortitude. Imagine a pigeon, let's call him Valiant, taking to the air from a forward observation post. He's carrying urgent coordinates for an enemy gun emplacement that's been wreaking havoc on the Allied lines. As he clears the shattered tree line, a sniper's bullet zips past, then another. One finds its mark, tearing through his wing, shattering bone and sinew. The pain must be intense, his ability to fly severely compromised. He falters, losing altitude, spiraling downwards. Many a lesser creature, human or animal, might give up at this point, succumbing to injury and shock. But Valiant doesn't. Driven by that deep-seated need to reach home, he somehow manages to regain a degree of control. Perhaps he can only use one wing effectively, his flight becoming a lopsided, desperate struggle. He flies lower now, more vulnerable, but still doggedly pushing onward. Every wing beat is in agony, yet he continues. He might have to land several times, resting, gathering his strength, before taking to the air again. His journey, which should have taken an hour, might stretch to 3 or 4. But eventually, bloodied and exhausted, he makes it back to his loft. The message, though delayed, is delivered. The pigeoneer who retrieves him marvels at the bird's sheer grit, gently tending to its wounds, knowing it has given its all. Then there's the case of pigeons flying through poison gas. We've touched on this before, but it bears repeating. Imagine a bird released into a sky where the air itself is a weapon. The acrid smell, the burning sensation in its eyes and lungs, it must have been terrifying and deeply disorienting. Yet many pigeons flew through these chemical clouds. Some would arrive at their lofts with their eyes swollen shut, their breathing ragged, sometimes even coughing up blood. The pigeoneers would do their best to cleanse them, wiping their eyes and trying to ease their suffering. Historians still ponder why exactly these birds didn't simply turn back or land when encountering such noxious fumes. Was their homing instinct so overwhelmingly powerful that it overrode even the most basic survival responses to flee a toxic environment? One particularly poignant type of injury involved shrapnel. A pigeon flying through an artillery barrage was essentially navigating an aerial minefield of jagged, high-velocity metal fragments. A bird might be struck in the body, its feathers torn, its flesh ripped. Yet, unless the wound was instantly fatal, many would struggle on. There are documented cases of pigeons arriving at their lofts with pieces of shrapnel still embedded in them. One famous British pigeon, whose name isn't as widely remembered as Sher Ami but whose bravery was no less, reportedly arrived with its breast feathers scorched and a piece of shrapnel lodged near its heart, still carrying its message. The recovery of these wounded heroes was often remarkable. Pigeoneers became adept at bird first aid. They would clean wounds, splint broken legs or wings where possible, and provide quiet, comfortable spaces for the injured birds to recuperate. Sher Ami herself is a prime example. Army medics worked tirelessly to save her life. They amputated her shattered leg and managed to patch up her chest wound. Though she would never fly a mission again, she survived, a testament to both her own resilience and the care she received. This dedication to saving wounded birds wasn't just sentimental. Every trained pigeon was a valuable asset, and if a bird could be nursed back to health, it might fly again, or at the very least, be used for breeding, passing on its strong homing genes. One quirky tidbit is that some pigeoneers develop their own local remedies and techniques for treating common pigeon ailments or injuries, knowledge passed down through generations of civilian fanciers, now adapted for the battlefield. The sheer determination of these birds, flying on with broken wings, blinded eyes, or bodies pierced by enemy fire, is profoundly moving. They had no understanding of the war, of the causes or the stakes involved. Their courage was an instinctive, biological imperative. Yet the results of their actions, the lives saved, the vital intelligence delivered, were undeniably heroic in human terms. These weren't just feathered automatons. They were living creatures pushed to the very limits of their endurance, and often beyond. Each wounded bird that made it home was a small miracle, a testament to the incredible power of nature's engineering and the unyielding call of home. Their silent, suffering flights painted a vivid, if often overlooked, picture of the brutal realities and unexpected heroism of the Great War. While Cher Ami is often the star of World War I pigeon lore, especially in American accounts, she was by no means the only feathered hero whose deeds were recorded and celebrated. Across the Allied forces, other pigeons displayed extraordinary courage and delivered crucial intelligence under fire. Let's gently turn our attention to another of these remarkable birds, a British pigeon known as the mocker. His story, though perhaps less dramatic in its immediate life-saving impact than Cher Ami's, highlights the vital role these avian messengers played in gathering intelligence, sometimes in very cunning ways. The Mocker's service predates Cher Ami's most famous flight, taking place earlier in the war. You find yourself now with a British artillery unit, sometime in 1917. The gunners are trying to accurately target German artillery batteries that are well camouflaged and causing significant problems. Pinpointing the exact location of these enemy guns is notoriously difficult. Aerial reconnaissance by early aircraft was still hazardous and not always precise, and ground observers often couldn't get close enough without drawing heavy fire. This is where pigeons like the mocker came into their own. He wasn't just carrying messages from the front. He was part of a system designed to help locate enemy positions. The method, while simple in principle, was quite ingenious. Pigeons would be released from advanced positions, and their flight path carefully observed. If a pigeon flew directly over a suspected enemy battery and drew fire, it not only confirmed the presence of the enemy but, by noting where the pigeon was when it was shot at, observers could get a much better triangulation on the gun's location. It was a risky business for the bird, essentially acting as live bait, but the intelligence gained could be invaluable. The mocker, a handsome blue checker, had a reputation for being a particularly reliable and swift flyer. On one notable occasion, he was sent up with a message from a forward trench detailing the suspected location of a newly established German machine gun nest that was enfilading the British lines, making any advance or even supply run incredibly dangerous. As the mocker took to the air, he immediately drew fire from this very nest. He was hit, but like Cher Ami, he didn't fall. He faltered, but then, with that incredible pigeon determination, he pressed on. He arrived back at his loft, wounded in the head and with one eye damaged, an injury that would sadly later cost him the sight in that eye. But the message he carried, combined with the observation of where he had drawn fire, allowed British artillery to accurately target and neutralize the machine gun nest within hours. His flight directly contributed to silencing a dangerous enemy position and undoubtedly saved British lives that would have been lost attacking it or being exposed to its fire. Historians still ponder why exactly some pigeons seemed almost to understand the need to fly through danger, while others might attempt to evade it more erratically. Perhaps it was just a stronger homing instinct overriding immediate perceived threats. The mocker continued to serve even after this injury, though his vision impairment likely made his flights more challenging. His bravery was recognized, and he became one of the many pigeons whose stories were used to boost morale and highlight the important, if unconventional, contributions of animals to the war effort. One quirky tidbit related to this kind of intelligence gathering involved the use of what were sometimes called spy pigeons. These weren't pigeons in tiny trench coats and fedoras, but rather birds released from unknown locations within or near enemy territory by reconnaissance patrols or agents who had infiltrated behind the lines. These pigeons would carry back reports on troop movements, supply dumps, or defensive preparations. The challenge, of course, was getting the pigeon and its handler into enemy territory in the first place, and then ensuring the pigeon could orient itself back to an Allied loft from an entirely unfamiliar starting point. This required exceptionally well-trained birds. The Germans, too, were aware of this tactic and were vigilant against it. Another pigeon whose story is worth noting is G.I. Joe, an American pigeon who served in World War II, but whose heroism echoes that of his World War I predecessors. During the British advance on the German-held Italian town of Calvi Vecchia in 1943, Allied air support was called in to bomb the town. However, British forces managed to capture the town ahead of schedule. The bombing raid was imminent, and radio communications failed. G.I. Joe was released with a message to cancel the attack. He flew 20 miles in 20 minutes, arriving just as the bombers were preparing to take off. His message prevented the bombing of the town and saved the lives of at least 100 British soldiers and countless Italian civilians. For this, G.I. Joe was awarded the Dickin Medal, which we'll discuss more later. These stories of the mocker, G.I. Joe, and countless other unnamed pigeons highlight the diverse roles these birds played. They weren't just passive message carriers. They were active participants in intelligence gathering, sometimes acting as decoys, sometimes as the sole link between isolated units and their command. Their contributions, often made at great personal risk, were a vital part of the Allied war effort in both world wars. Each bird, with its unique number and its often unrecorded acts of endurance, was a small hero in a global conflict. Their silent flights wrote chapters in the story of wartime communication that are only now being fully appreciated. While Cher Ami and the Mocker are renowned for their exploits in saving battalions or pinpointing enemy guns, another pigeon played a crucial, if perhaps less dramatically injured, role during one of the largest American operations of World War I, the Meuse-Argonne Offensive. This bird, fittingly named President Wilson, after the then U.S. President, delivered a message that was critical to the success of a significant American advance. You find yourself amidst the noise and confusion of this massive offensive, a sprawling battlefront involving over 1 million American soldiers. The Meuse-Argonne Offensive, launched in late September 1918, was the final major Allied push on the Western Front. It was a vast, complex operation, aiming to break through the heavily fortified German Hindenburg Line and force an end to the war. Communication across such a broad and rapidly shifting front was, as you can imagine, a monumental challenge. Telephone lines were constantly being cut by artillery, radio was still unreliable and vulnerable to interception, and runners faced the hellish landscape of machine gun fire and shell craters. In this environment, the U.S. Army's Signal Corps' Pigeon service was stretched to its limits, but proved its worth time and again. President Wilson, a handsome bird, likely a blue checker or perhaps a grizzle, was stationed with an American infantry unit deep in the Argonne forest. This dense, rugged terrain made ground communication exceptionally difficult. On October 5, 1918, just a couple of days after Sher Ami's famous flight for the Lost Battalion, who were, in fact, part of this same offensive, President Wilson was entrusted with a particularly vital dispatch. An American infantry battalion had managed to push forward, seizing a key village and a section of German trench line. However, they were now in a precarious position, exposed and in urgent need of artillery support to help them hold their gains and repel expected German counterattacks. Their field telephone lines had been obliterated by shelling, and their radio was out of action. They needed to get word back to their artillery batteries, several miles to the rear, with precise coordinates for fire support. Any delay could mean losing their hard-won ground and suffering heavy casualties. The message was hastily written, detailing their position and the urgent need for a protective barrage. It was attached to President Wilson's leg. You can picture the scene: a young American officer, his face grim with responsibility, releasing the bird into a sky hazy with smoke and the constant thud of distant guns. The fate of his men, and the success of this small part of the larger offensive, rested on this single pigeon. President Wilson flew like the wind. He navigated the confusing, battle-scarred landscape of the Argonne, dodging shell bursts and evading enemy attention. He wasn't just flying home. He was racing against time. He covered the considerable distance back to his mobile loft, located near the artillery headquarters. In exceptionally fast time, some accounts say he flew nearly 25 miles in about 25 minutes, an average speed of a mile a minute, which is top speed for a racing pigeon, especially under wartime conditions. Historians still ponder why exactly President Wilson achieved such remarkable speed on this particular flight. Perhaps a favorable tailwind, or maybe just the sheer urgency somehow communicated itself to the bird, though the latter is, of course, pure romantic speculation. Upon his arrival, the message was rushed to the artillery commanders. Within minutes, American guns were thundering, laying down a precise and effective barrage that protected the exposed infantry, broke up forming German counterattacks, and allowed the Americans to consolidate their gains. President Wilson's swift flight had directly contributed to a significant local success within the broader Meuse-Argonne offensive. While he didn't suffer the dramatic injuries of Sher Ami, his speed and reliability under pressure were no less heroic. His mission ensured that a vital piece of the offensive puzzle fell into place. One quirky tidbit about the naming of these pigeons: while many were simply known by their serial numbers, pigeonniers often gave their favorite or most reliable birds pet names. Naming a bird President Wilson was a clear sign of the high regard in which this particular pigeon was held, and perhaps a touch of patriotic fervor. Other pigeons had names like Kaiser Bill, perhaps a bird used for particularly risky missions against German lines, Big Tom, or Spike. These names added a touch of personality to these feathered soldiers. President Wilson's flight, though less graphic than Sher Ami's, underscores a different aspect of pigeon heroism: sheer efficiency and reliability under extreme pressure. In a massive, fast-moving battle like the Meuse-Argonne, the ability to get accurate information from the front to the rear quickly and consistently was absolutely critical for command and control. Pigeons like President Wilson were the unsung workhorses of this communication effort, performing countless such missions, each one contributing to the overall operational picture. His story, and those of many other pigeons who delivered vital messages during this offensive, demonstrated the enduring value of the pigeon's service, even in the age of increasingly sophisticated military technology. When all else failed, the bird often got through. President Wilson, the feathered namesake of a wartime leader, played his own small but significant part in leading the way to an Allied victory. The extraordinary bravery and life-saving contributions of animals in wartime, particularly those of pigeons like Cher Ami, the Mocker, and President Wilson, did not go entirely unnoticed or unrewarded by the human beneficiaries of their service. While a pigeon might not appreciate a shiny medal in the same way a human soldier would, the creation of awards specifically for animal heroes served as a powerful symbol of recognition and gratitude. You're now witnessing the genesis of one such honor, the Dickin Medal. The Dickin Medal was instituted in 1943, during World War II, by Maria Dickin, founder of the People's Dispensary for Sick Animals, PDSA, a British veterinary charity. It was specifically created to honor the work of animals in war, often described as the Animals Victoria Cross, or the Animals Medal of Honor. For American audiences, it is a large, bronze medallion, bearing the words, "For Gallantry," and "We also serve," within a laurel wreath, suspended from a ribbon of green, dark brown, and pale blue stripes, symbolizing the naval, military/air, and auxiliary services. While its creation occurred during World War II, the spirit behind it certainly encompassed the incredible deeds of World War I animals as well, and several World War I pigeons were retrospectively acknowledged or their stories helped inspire its founding. The medal could be awarded to any animal displaying conspicuous gallantry or devotion to duty while serving with His Majesty's Armed Forces or Civil Defense units. This included dogs, horses, cats, and of course, pigeons. Between 1943 and 1949, the initial period of awarding for World War II service, 54 Dickin medals were bestowed. Of these, a remarkable 32 went to pigeons, highlighting the absolutely crucial role these birds played in communication, especially for the Royal Air Force, the Army, and even spies and resistance movements. Dogs received 18 medals, horses 3, and rather charmingly, one went to a ship's cat named Simon for his rat-catching duties and morale-boosting presence aboard HMS Amethyst during the Yangtze incident in 1949. The citations for the pigeon recipients of the Dickin Medal read like miniature epics of courage and endurance. For instance, the pigeon, Commando, received his medal for successfully delivering messages from agents in occupied France on 3 occasions, despite extreme danger. Paddy, an Irish pigeon, was recognized for the fastest recorded time for a message delivery during the D-Day Normandy landings, flying nearly 230 miles over the English Channel in just under 4 hours and 50 minutes, through terrible weather and past lurking German falcons, bringing back the first news of the Allied landing's success. Historians still ponder why exactly some pigeons seem to thrive on such long, hazardous overwater flights, a particularly challenging navigational feat. Another recipient, William of Orange, serving with the Army, delivered a crucial message from the surrounded airborne troops at Arnhem during Operation Market Garden in September 1944. He flew over 260 miles, taking over 4 hours, arriving exhausted but successful, providing vital information that, while ultimately unable to save the besieged force, was critical for understanding their plight. The conditions at Arnhem were horrific, and William was the only one of several pigeons released by the 1st British Airborne Division to make it through. One particularly quirky tidbit regarding the Dickin Medal involves the pigeon, Gustave. Gustave brought back the very first news from the Normandy beaches on D-Day, June 6, 1944. He was released by a Reuters correspondent accompanying the Allied invasion fleet and flew 150 miles back to his loft in England in 5 hours and 16 minutes, battling a strong headwind. His message simply read, "We are just 20 miles or so off the beaches. First assault troops landed 0750. This gave the world the first, albeit brief, confirmation that the largest amphibious invasion in history was underway. Imagine the excitement in that English loft as Gustave arrived, carrying such monumental news. While Cher Ami served in World War I, before the Dickin Medal was created, she was posthumously awarded a medal from the Organized Bird Fanciers of Great Britain and inducted into the Racing Pigeon Hall of Fame. Had the Dickin Medal existed in her time, she would undoubtedly have been one of its earliest and most celebrated recipients. Her preserved body, with its battle scars, is on display at the Smithsonian National Museum of American History, a testament to her bravery. Many other World War I pigeons received certificates of merit or unofficial commendations from their units, tangible acknowledgments of their invaluable service. The Dickin Medal served, and continues to serve. It is still awarded, though less frequently, as a poignant reminder that human conflicts invariably draw in the animal kingdom, often with devastating consequences for them, but also sometimes revealing incredible instances of loyalty, courage, and devotion to duty. It gives a formal voice to our appreciation for these non-human companions who have served alongside us, often silently and without understanding the full context of their actions, but performing their roles with an instinctual bravery that is deeply humbling. The pigeons, soaring above the mud and wire, delivering their tiny, life-saving messages, were truly deserving of such recognition. The formal recognition provided by awards like the Dickin Medal was significant, but the ways in which individual pigeons, particularly celebrated ones like Cher Ami, were honored and remembered by the soldiers and the public provide a more personal and often touching insight into their perceived heroism. You're now witnessing the aftermath of these courageous flights, as these feathered veterans were lauded, cared for, and in some cases, immortalized. Let's return to Cher Ami. After her incredible, life-saving flight for the Lost Battalion, she became a bona fide hero. News of her bravery spread far and wide. Army medics, as we've mentioned, worked diligently to save her life. Her shattered leg was beyond repair and had to be amputated, so they carved a small wooden peg leg for her. Imagine this battle-scarred pigeon, a veteran of countless flights, now sporting a tiny prosthetic. It's a poignant, slightly surreal image. She was nursed back to health, becoming a cherished mascot of the U.S. Army Signal Corps. When General John J. Pershing, the commander of the American Expeditionary Forces in Europe, heard of Cher Ami's exploit, he was reportedly deeply moved. He made a point of visiting her, a testament to the significance of her contribution. She was even awarded the Croix de Guerre, a French military decoration for bravery, with a palm oak leaf cluster. It's quite something to picture a small pigeon being presented with such a prestigious military honor, typically reserved for human soldiers who had distinguished themselves by acts of heroism involving combat with enemy forces. Historians still ponder why exactly the French military chose to bestow one of its highest honors on an American pigeon, but it certainly underscored the international appreciation for her bravery. Upon her return to the United States after the war, Cher Ami was a celebrity. She was cared for by the pigeoneer who had been her handler in France, a man named Enoch Clifford Swain, who had a deep affection for her. She became a symbol of the courage and sacrifice of all the animals who had served. Her story was recounted in newspapers and magazines, inspiring a sense of wonder and admiration. When she eventually died in 1919, likely from complications related to her war wounds, her body was carefully preserved by a taxidermist. As mentioned, she was then donated to the Smithsonian Institution, where she remains on display to this day at the National Museum of American History, a permanent tribute to her valor. Millions of visitors have seen her, a small, one-eyed, one-legged pigeon who saved nearly 200 men. Other pigeons, though perhaps not achieving the international fame of Cher Ami, were also honored in their own ways. Many pigeoneers kept meticulous records of their bird's service, noting down particularly brave flights or narrow escapes. These service records became treasured mementos. Sometimes, units would informally promote a particularly reliable pigeon to the rank of Sergeant Squawks, or some other affectionate, mock military title. It was a way of acknowledging their contribution with a touch of soldier's humor. One quirky tidbit is that after the war, there was a surge in public interest in pigeon racing and fancying, partly fueled by the heroic stories of war pigeons. These birds, once seen perhaps as a niche hobby, were now viewed with a new respect. Their incredible navigational abilities and their wartime service had captured the public imagination. Some returning pigeoners even brought back their favorite feathered comrades to live out their days in peaceful civilian lofts. In Britain, the stories of pigeons like the Mocker and later, the World War II Dickin Medal recipients, were widely publicized by organizations like the PDSA to raise awareness and funds for animal welfare. Postcards and pamphlets featuring these animal heroes were common. This not only honored the animals but also served to remind the public of the often overlooked role that animals played in the war effort. The memorials to war animals, which often include pigeons in their imagery, also serve as a lasting tribute. The Animals in War Memorial in Hyde Park, London, unveiled in 2004, features a striking sculpture of a mule laden with supplies, but also includes friezes depicting various other animals, including pigeons, with the inscription, "They had no choice." This powerful statement acknowledges the involuntary nature of their service while honoring their contribution. The way these pigeons were celebrated through medals, public recognition, museum exhibits, and personal affection speaks volumes about the human need to acknowledge bravery and sacrifice, even in non-human forms. These birds, through their instinct and endurance, touched the lives of countless soldiers and played a tangible role in the outcome of battles. Honoring them was, in a way, honoring the best aspects of dedication and resilience, wherever they might be found. Their legacies, preserved in stories and memorials, ensure that their silent service above the battlefields is not forgotten. The Great War finally shuddered to a halt on November 11, 1918. The guns fell silent, the smoke began to clear, and a weary world started to contemplate the immense cost and the long road to recovery. But what became of the thousands of feathered veterans, the pigeons who had flown countless perilous missions, carrying messages of life and death? Their war was over too. You're now witnessing the transition of these avian heroes from active service to a more peaceful, post-war existence. For many pigeons, the end of the war meant a return to a life somewhat resembling their pre-war existence, though often under new ownership or in different lofts. The vast military pigeon services were demobilized, just like the human armies. Lofts were dismantled, and the birds were, for the most part, sold off or returned to civilian life. Many were acquired by pigeon fanciers, eager to own birds with a proven wartime record. A pigeon that had successfully navigated the shell-torn skies of France was a valuable asset, not just for its homing ability but also for its potential as breeding stock. The thinking was that these battle-hardened birds, survivors of incredible adversity, must possess superior genes for strength, intelligence, and navigation qualities highly prized in racing pigeons. Imagine an auction of surplus military pigeons. Fanciers from across Britain, France, Belgium, and even America might gather, examining the birds, checking their leg bands, looking for those telltale signs of a seasoned flyer. A bird like President Wilson, known for his speed, or a descendant of a bird like the Mocker, known for his resilience, would have been highly sought after. Historians still ponder why exactly the racing performance of offspring from war pigeons didn't always correlate directly with the parents' wartime service, suggesting that while genetics played a role, the unique pressures and training of wartime service also shaped an individual bird's extraordinary capabilities. Some pigeoners who had formed strong bonds with their charges during the war made efforts to acquire their favorite birds. Enoch Clifford Swain, Sher Ami's devoted handler, is a perfect example. He ensured she was cared for until her death. For these men, the pigeons weren't just military assets. They were companions, individuals whose courage they had witnessed firsthand. Taking them home was a way of acknowledging that bond and ensuring a comfortable retirement. However, not all pigeons had such a comfortable transition. The sheer number of surplus birds meant that many were likely sold for more utilitarian purposes, perhaps for meat, which was a common practice at the time, especially with food shortages still prevalent after the war. It's a slightly less romantic end for a war hero, but it was a practical reality of the time. One quirky tidbit from the post-war era is the continued, albeit reduced, role of pigeons in some military and governmental communications. While radio and telephone technology continued to advance rapidly, making pigeons less critical, they weren't entirely abandoned. Some armies maintained smaller pigeon sections for specialized tasks or as a backup system. Even into World War II, as we've seen with the Dickin Medal recipients, pigeons played a vital role, proving that sometimes older technology still had its place. The British Intelligence Service, MI6, famously continued to use pigeons for clandestine communication well into the Cold War period, a testament to their reliability and difficulty to intercept compared to electronic signals. For the famous pigeons, like Sher Ami, before her passing, and others whose stories had captured public imagination, their post-war life could involve a degree of celebrity. They might be featured in exhibitions, their stories told in newspapers, serving as living symbols of animal heroism. Their presence helped to keep the memory of the war, and the sacrifices made, alive in the public consciousness. The mobile lofts, those converted buses and wagons that had served as homes on the move for the pigeons, were also decommissioned. Some were likely broken up for scrap, while others might have been repurposed for civilian use, their sides perhaps still bearing the faint outlines of their military markings or the patched holes from shrapnel. Each one carried the silent stories of the birds it had housed, and the messages it had received. The legacy of the World War I pigeons lived on not just in the birds themselves but also in the advancements in understanding avian navigation and the continued development of pigeon racing as a sport. The war had, in a grim way, been a massive, uncontrolled experiment in pigeon endurance and homing ability, providing a wealth of data and anecdotal evidence. As you picture these birds settling into their post-war lives, some in comfortable lofts, others perhaps less, so there's a sense of a chapter closing. Their vital, dangerous work was done. They had faced the worst of human conflict, and through their innate abilities and incredible resilience, had played a small but significant part in it. The skies above Europe were quieter now, and for these feathered veterans, it was a well-deserved peace. The gentle cooing seems to fade now, the image of those determined, feathered messengers dissolving into the soft quiet of your room. We've journeyed with them, from ancient Egypt to the smoke-filled skies of the Western Front, marveling at their instinct, their endurance, and the surprising depth of their contribution to human conflicts. We've seen them recruited, meticulously trained, and sent on missions where they faced unimaginable dangers, from enemy fire to treacherous weather, all to deliver tiny capsules of information that often meant the difference between life and death, success and failure. We met Sher Ami, the one-legged hero who saved the lost battalion, her name forever etched in the annals of bravery. We flew alongside the Mocker, whose intelligence gathering helped silence enemy guns, and President Wilson, whose swift flight secured vital artillery support during a major offensive. These were not just anonymous birds. They were individuals, each with a story, each a testament to the incredible power of nature and the unexpected bonds that can form between humans and animals, even in the midst of war. The Dickin Medal, the Animals Victoria Cross, stands as a formal tribute to their gallantry, a recognition that, We also serve applies to creatures great and small who find themselves caught in our human struggles. Their post-war lives, some celebrated, some quietly returned to civilian lofts, marked the end of their extraordinary service. As you drift deeper now, let the image of a lone pigeon, silhouetted against a fading wartime sky, winging its way steadfastly towards home, be a gentle guide. Let its quiet determination, its unwavering focus on its destination, bring a sense of peace to your own mind. The echoes of battle have long since faded, replaced by the tranquil hum of the present moment. The messages have all been delivered. It is time for rest. The sky is clear, the journey is over, and a profound stillness settles over everything. Sleep now, and dream of quiet skies and gentle wings.